Basically, we have a lot of problems, and I wanted to take those problems and turn them into solutions. For example, here in the area, we know we have great water quality problems. Eastern North Carolina, a lot of agricultural runoff. We've got our hog lagoons, our poultry production. Here locally in New Hanover County, pet waste is the biggest water quality problem. So I saw this problem, these nutrients going into the water. Now, how can we get those nutrients out of the water and turn it into something good? So hold that in your mind there. Also, other problems we have here. We have very little domestic fuel production. It was very scary after Katrina. They stopped fuel trucks across the state. There was supply problems. Now, what happens when the petroleum does go out and we're at peak oil? We're going to run out in 4 or 5 decades of at least cheap oil. So why isn't anyone looking towards domestic production? Why aren't we making our own fuel? I just think it's silly that there's not a single ethanol station here in New Hanover County, except for the DOT. They have a small ethanol station, but that's not open to the public. So where can we solve this problem producing domestically? Also, we've got the air quality issues. There might be a future tax on carbon. Is there a way to make a fuel that's not just burning carbon into the air, but also sequestering that carbon in the same year? Also, there's need for animal feeds, the fish, poultry, and hog industry. Can all these problems be solved with one thing? Well, maybe. So we want to look for solutions that are efficient, that turn waste streams into surpluses, and that combine functions. I know Ian actually put out a release about the NCDOT growing canola along roadsides. The DOT already has to mow these roadside edges, and they put wildflowers there, whatnot, but why not plant both a good pollinator crop like canola, and that canola also doubles as an oilseed crop. So we want to combine functions with our production systems, and we really want to emulate what the ecology is doing. We want to follow how nutrients cycle through the ecosystem and kind of emulate that in a production, in a commercial system. So let's talk about ethanol for a second. Ethanol is, it's great to drink. Some of us are drinking it right now. It's derived from sugars, starches, cellulose, or lignin. Sugars are the easiest thing to turn into alcohol because you feed the sugar to yeast. Yeast is a type of fungi. The yeast, as it eats the sugar in fermentation, the yeast produce two things. One, alcohol, the other, carbon dioxide. You can actually sequester, you can collect the carbon dioxide, compress it, and use it for as a value-added product later. And then the alcohol, which is essentially, it's the byproduct of yeast metabolism. So it's basically it's yeast poop, if you will. And that ethanol, once you've distilled it and you remove the water, then you can put it in your vehicle. And the first Ford Model T ran on ethanol. In fact, up until the very last year before Prohibition ended, Henry Ford had the ability to toggle between petroleum, gasoline, or bio-based ethanol in his vehicle. North Carolina doing that. Novozymes, for example, is a major producer of ethanol enzymes. So now we know a little bit about the process of ethanol production. And let's take corn, for example. Since most of the ethanol produced in the United States comes from corn, it's a good thing to use, although corn is not the best ethanol feedstock. Corn delivered to a grinder, they pound it up, and then they put it in a big tank with some water, and they cook it, they heat it up, breaking apart that biomass, and then they add in the enzyme to loosen the sugars apart, and they add in the yeast, and boom, and then you have fermentation. The CO2, which you can collect and compress and then reintroduce into a greenhouse system. Greenhouses are most often limited by CO2. If you can introduce CO2 into a greenhouse, you can triple yield sometimes. So CO2, and that's clean CO2. CO2 off of a coal-fired power plant, very dirty, has some heavy metals in it, not as good of a product. But CO2 coming off of a beer production system is great. In fact, so Colorado State University, the New Belgium Brewing Company out in Fort Collins, Colorado, they produce a lot of CO2, which goes into these greenhouses. It grows algae, and the algae makes biodiesel that runs the trucks that deliver the beer. So that's an example of this tying your whole system and not wasting resource coming off your production train. Once you distill it, you distill your wort. It's basically a mixture of water, your starches. You get the ethanol off, and you're left over with this wet grain, which you can dry, and you make dry distiller's grains. Dry distiller grains, great feed or feed supplement for hogs, pigs, and cows. So here we're not wasting the leftover residue, we're actually going to feed it. And farmers really seek out dry distiller grains, because if you feed a cow corn that hasn't had the starch removed, they're just going to poop out the starch. Cows cannot digest starch, so it's way better to take the starch off the front end than trying to remove the starch from manure. And it makes the cows happier and healthier. They make better milk, higher omega-3s. So again, just being clever about all of the streams coming off your system. So now let's talk about a feedstock that I'm just super passionate about, duckweed. And if we go back to the very front slide, this is duckweed. Who's seen duckweed before? Everyone should raise their hand. It's everywhere. This little plant, and this is blown up. These things are really, really tiny. They are an amazing plant because they're stemless. They don't produce any cellulose or lignin. They float on the surface of the water. So instead of putting any energy into those, like a tall tree trunk that's the support for the tree, they put all their energy into producing starch or proteins. So here it is, just a wonderful little package of biofuel for us. Another great thing about this plant is it can grow on wastewater. It grows in hog lagoons, municipal wastewater. There's about 5 genera and about 40 species. They grow in what looks like a monoculture, but it's really a polyculture. You get several different duckweeds usually growing together. I see it out there, Airlie Gardens, growing on our lakes because we receive a lot of nutrient-rich stormwater runoff. And at the height of the summer, sometimes you get fish kills because all this biomass that's been growing and growing, it eventually dies. The bacteria that break it down, they burn up all the dissolved oxygen in the water, the fish die. So there's a problem. How do we fix it? One way to fix that is to continually harvest the duckweed off the water, because the duckweed is sequestering these nutrients. Another cool thing about duckweed, it's actually the world's smallest flowering plant, but it doesn't tend to reproduce sexually with the flower. It tends to produce asexually through a process called budding. In a 30-hour period, duckweed can double its population. It is the fastest, well, one of the fastest growing plants in the world, if not the fastest growing plant. It's really easy to harvest too, compared to a lot of other aquatic plants. Cattail would be an example of another ethanol feedstock that grows in the water. Very hard to harvest and dig up out of the wet marsh soils. But the great thing about duckweed is skimmable. And NC State has actually devised a clever way of actually pumping off that duckweed that floats on the surface of the water, using the surface tension of the water to kind of draw all these duckweed patches into one central funnel. It's very clever, but very simple. Also, the duckweed, because it floats on top of the water, now competes the other aquatics in there. So it gets all the sunlight, and things below aren't going to grow as well. It's going to outcompete some of the algae species. And why we love duckweed so much, per square foot, but keep in mind you have to grow in an aquatic environment, per square foot, duckweed can make 6 times the amount of starch as corn. So it is a great biofuel feedstock. And what is super about duckweed is we don't need to cultivate a new field. We simply have to inoculate existing ponds that are rich in nutrients, such as hog lagoons. We'll get there. Duckweed's also native to the area. Pretty cool. Alright, so duckweed currently is used mostly for phytoremediation in wastewater treatment plants across the world, from Australia to Peru, Vietnam, and even here in North Carolina. There's a small town called Hookerton, North Carolina, that didn't have the money to invest in a new wastewater treatment plant, so they started to do some of their, I guess, secondary, tertiary wastewater treatment by polishing with duckweed, and it's working. A lot of people use duckweed for aquaculture. They call duckweed because ducks love to eat it, as well as other waterfowl, as well as fish, because it's high in proteins and a lot of starch. You can also compost the duckweed. So a lot of uses that are already being used. It's currently not so much being used for fuel production, but it should be. This is a map of eastern North Carolina. The darker it gets, the more hogs there are. Hogs produce 3 to 6 times as much waste as a human does in an average day. So we have millions and millions of hogs. Only Iowa makes more hogs than North Carolina. We are also #1 in poultry production in the United States as far as turkeys. So we are just sitting on a poop mine of gold right here. All we have to do is take these existing lagoons, these aquatic habitats where duckweed will grow, and start growing it there. We turn our hog farmers not just into meat producers, but into energy producers. And they're cleaning water, this is a good thing, and they also make a feed for their animals. And there's lots of studies on the health behind that, because there are some concerns. Duckweed does sequester some heavy metals, but it just depends on what nutrient solution you're giving your duckweed. If you took all the hog lagoons in eastern North Carolina and converted them to also produce duckweed, we could displace upwards of 10%, 15% of our current liquid petroleum use in the state. So that's a pretty big wedge, and it's going to take a lot of different wedges to displace our total petroleum use. Great thing about duckweed, you can harvest it daily. Pretty easy to dry out. You can use this exact same technology to produce corn ethanol as you do to make duckweed ethanol. So you don't have to reinvent anything or invent anything new. And NC State, they're all over this. There's actually a doctor up there, Dr. Ann Stump. They've genetically modified the duckweed for use in pharmaceuticals, another use for it. There's places all over the world where it's already being used for wastewater treatment, but I think it has a huge potential to not just treat wastewater, but also to make fuel. In China, for example, one of the things they've done for years is at the mouths of all the rivers, all the agricultural runoff, it's coming down and it's flooding these very bioproductive areas, the marshes along the coast. And they decided, well, the nutrient can go out there and create this huge hypoxic or oxygen-depleted zone and kill all the fish, or we can start farming kelp. And they started to farm kelp on the mouths of all these big rivers, and that kelp is used as a feed supplement, and it removes the excess nutrients in the water. So this is a way for us to close our nutrient cycle. So those were just some ideas. I think I've already gone over my 10 minutes, so that's all I can say for now, but think about duckweed. It's in our future. Thank you, sir.